It's October 2025, and what's a better time and place to try your first ocean cruise than the Bay of Biscay in late autumn? My ship for this 7-day cruise round the Bay of Biscay is the P&O MV Arcadia, built in Italy by Fincantieri in their shipyard in Gare on the mainland of the Venetian lagoon between 2003 and 2004, and launched on the 26th of June 2004, making her 21 years old at the time of sailing. Originally constructed for Holland America, a shuffle around in orders at parent company Carnival Line saw her being fitted out as a vessel for Cunard before the last minute change of plans and being passed over to P&O. At 83,342 gross tonnes, 289.9 metres long, 32.2 metres wide and with 11 decks, she's the second smallest ship in P&O's fleet. But given my previous experience of cruising have all been on cruise ferries, the Arcadia is still much bigger. For comparison, my first Hertha trip was on the MS Lofoten, 32 times lighter, barely a quarter the length, less than half the width, and with only 4 passenger decks. Whilst flagged in Bermuda, the Arcadia has its home port in Southampton, and on a miserably wet mid-October Sunday, that's where we boarded the ship for a trip that should have seen us visiting A Coruña, Gijón and Santander in Spain, along with Cherbourg in France. Though as time would soon show, that wasn't going to be the actual plan, as at the same time as we were boarding, the Met offices in most of Western Europe were eyeing up a rapidly developing low in the Atlantic, which was heading straight for the English Channel and the North Sea. Eventually named Benjamin by Météo France on the Wednesday, its effects would be felt not just across the coast of England, France, Belgium, Germany and the Netherlands, but also Spain, which means it was heading, at the same time as us, to the Bay of Biscay. The Bay of Biscay, also known as the Gulf of Gascony in France, is a large bay in Western Europe that forms the coastline of most of western France and the whole of northern Spain. Despite dropping to nearly 5,000 metres as its lowest point, it is, on the whole, surprisingly shallow, with the European continental shelf extending far out into the bay. With the shallow waters, the storms that blow into the bay are magnified as previously smaller waves are pushed up in the similar effect of a tidal wave. The Bay of Biscay is home to some of the Atlantic Ocean's fiercest weather, abnormally high waves, and until recent years the regular graveyard of merchant vessels foundering in terrifying Biscay storms. All in all, the Bay of Biscay is not an area of water you want to be messing around in. But hey, what's the worst that can happen on a, checks notes, 21-year-old cruise ship? We'd been able to board early, so before our official departure time, I was able to have an explore around the ship whilst it was still relatively empty. Fully loaded, the Arcadia can be home to up to 2,094 passengers and 866 crew. Starting up at the Crow's Nest bar high on deck 10, I then made my way down in the panoramic glass lifts, that looked like they could do with a seriously good clean, to the main deck of the ship, deck 3. The main atrium of the ship is pretty much in the centre and spans over decks 1, 2 and 3. With each floor being home to a mixture of bars, restaurants, shops, and on the lower deck the ship's reception desks. In a brief lull in the weather, whilst it was only drizzling slightly rather than absolutely bucketing it down, I headed out along the promenade deck to the non-pointy end or stern of the ship to take in the not necessarily beautiful sights of the port of Southampton and Southampton Water. The weather closed in again around 4 p.m. just as the crew slipped our moorings and the tugboat, assisted by the bow thrusters, gently manoeuvred us out into the channel of Southampton water and a very slow sail down from the furthest berthing point for cruise ships in the city towards the mouth of the River Itchen and the Solent. Passing along the way, the Red Funnel terminal for ferries making the much shorter voyage, the 11 miles to Cowes on the Isle of Wight, though all of those achieving that journey time significantly quicker than our very genteel pace of this first part of the cruise. In fact, most of those ferries would have been able to do at least one full round trip before we finally started our sail past of Queen Victoria's holiday island, thankfully in a gap in the rain showers, meaning it was possible to head out on deck to take in the views of the northeast coast of Thetis, with Osborne House just about visible through the murk, standing out on top of the cliffs. A little while later we passed the Wootton Creek, home to Fishbourne, the main car ferry port on the island, and then in the distance the bright lights of Ryde. With our course now set to pass round the island and set sail for the Bay of Biscay, and with night rapidly falling, these would be the last sight of land we'd see for nearly 36 hours. The following morning, with the wind already gusting at gale force 8 and waves happily exceeding 5 metres in height, we finally left the English Channel and made the slight turn far out of sight of the French island of Ouessant that marks the northern perimeter of the Gulf of Gascony, as it's known here, marking our entrance into the swirling, churning pool of the Bay of Biscay. The entire day was at sea, just crossing the bay, with at times slight lulls before the winds and waves would pick up again, heading towards the 6-metre wave height and at points touching storm force 10 overnight, making walking around the ship increasingly difficult as the ground refused to stay put for more than a couple of seconds. Day 3, and it's not even dawn. In proof that Spain is probably in the wrong time zone, it's gone 8 a.m, and yet as we gently slide into port in A Coruña on the Galician coast of northern Spain, it's still not light. At nearly 8.5 degrees west of the prime meridian, the far west of Spain is over 90 minutes behind natural time. Add on daylight saving, which was still in effect, and sunrise isn't until 9 a.m, and the sun reaches the highest point in the sky, noon, at 2:17 p.m. A Coruña is a major cruise port on the Western European itineraries, being a convenient stop-off point at the southern end of the Bay of Biscay for cruises heading south towards Portugal and the Canary, Madeira or Azores Islands, or round into the Mediterranean. Consequently, we've arrived behind the Sky Princess, which we've been shadowing since Southampton, and had to settle for the overflow parking in the harbour. I've already visited A Coruña, details of that video click the link in the top right, but in quick summary, built on the site of an ancient Celtic hill fort, Romans, Tower of Hercules built, one of the oldest still working lighthouses in the world, Vikings, Tower of Hercules becomes a fortress, 13th century town refounded, 15th century upgraded to city, 16th century new castle constructed, just in time to humiliate the English counter-armada, also upgraded to capital of Kingdom of Galicia, 17th century first repairs in over a millennia to the Tower of Hercules, 18th century humiliates Napoleon, 20th century lose capital status to the newly formed community of Galicia to Santiago de Compostela, 21st century now the richest region of Galicia, including the port handling 75% of all Galicia's trade and being home to Interdix, parent company of, amongst others, Zara. The central area of the old town of A Coruña is located around the harbour with its traditional buildings decorated by their glass-fronted balconies, providing the light and ability to take in nature of the balcony with the protection from the weather of the north Spanish coast and the Bay of Biscay. The balconies look out over both the harbour and the park. As well as the central Plaza de Maria Pita, the central square that's also home to the City Hall and a large number of cafes and restaurants that fill rapidly after the cruise ships dock. Slightly further down from the main square is the modern Garden of San Carlos, built originally as a defensive castle outside the walls in the 14th century and then attached to the city by further fortifications 2 centuries later. The space inside was declared a historic garden on the 9th of November 1944. From the walls of the former fortifications, there are views out over the whole of the port of A Coruña, including back to both ships that were in port on that day. Departing the city a couple of hours later, quite a bit behind schedule, we sail past that castle built in the 16th century, Castelo di Santo Anton, that, despite still being under construction and only manned by 2 companies of soldiers and a handful of artillery pieces, was able to defend the southern flank of the old town from attack by Francis Drake and the English in retaliation for the Spanish Armada. Within seconds of leaving port, the winds and rain that preceded Storm Benjamin started to close in on us, making the city almost invisible and heralding the next leg of our journey deeper into the Bay of Biscay towards Gijón and then Santander. A journey that we would never complete in full. Day 4 of our cruise, and we've arrived in Gijón, or Gijón as it's pronounced in Asturian, though the actual cruise port is quite a long way out of town, which is going to be a problem as the incoming weather means that our time in the city has been dramatically cut short, with the captain wanting us to depart by 2 p.m. rather than the scheduled 5 p.m. Thankfully, the half-day tour of Gijón that we'd booked had us coming back to the ship by 1:30 and was consequently the only short excursion of the day that had survived. So a little after 10, we headed down to the coach and off for a tour of the city, first heading out to a viewpoint on the far eastern side of the city centre. The Mirador de la Providencia sits some 4 kilometres from the centre of the city and 7 kilometres from the port, providing views over the whole sweep of the small bay that the city sits within, with particularly good views of the Cima Villa, the oldest part of the city, built out on a small peninsula that was easy to defend and has been occupied since at least the Roman period, if not before. From the viewpoint, the tour then had a scenic drive back through the city before stopping off at a historic hotel for tapas and the chance to taste the local Asturian cider before returning to the ship for our early departure. The city has a rich history which, sadly, we had little time to explore due to our early departure, but in a quick rundown, archaeological excavations in the area suggest that humans have been living in the area around Gijón for around 7,000 years, with 2 Malayan Neolithic dolmens being discovered in the 1990s. Romans, Visigoths, capital of the Muslim territories for the short period for the Moorish conquest of Spain, made it all the way to the north coast. Captured by the Spanish from the First Battle of the Reconquista that would last over 600 years, destroyed in wars in the 14th century, rebuilt as a major fishing port in the 15th and 16th centuries, expanded beyond the Cima Villa in the 17th and 18th centuries, 19th century port expansion to handle the booming coal export industry, initially supported the Republican faction of the Spanish Civil War before falling to Franco's troops in 1937, latter part of the 20th century saw the decline of industry, in particular iron manufacturing. 21st century the city moved towards the services sector, with it starting to attract cruise ships and the establishment of a campus of the University of Oviedo in the city. On departing A Coruña the previous evening, the captain explained that our delayed departure had been caused by them negotiating a major change to our schedule to avoid Storm Benjamin, which was going to cause some pretty nasty seas in the Bay of Biscay and could have made docking in Santander difficult, if not impossible. Instead of continuing east along the northern Spanish coast and then having to cross diagonally back through the Bay of Biscay at the height of the storm, we were instead going to turn round at Gijón and make as quick an exit as possible from the bay and seek shelter in the port of Vigo on Spain's Atlantic coast, where a mooring point and times had been negotiated during the period of delay the previous afternoon. It also explained why we were departing Gijón several hours ahead of schedule in a desperate attempt to get out of the Bay of Biscay before the worst weather hit, with storm force 10 rising to hurricane force 12 winds and sea heights of 8 metres plus predicted. The captain wanted as much time as possible to flee the bay. Which is why the following morning our pre-dawn and slightly damp arrival was into Vigo on Galicia's Atlantic coast and not the scheduled Santander. And despite the captain's best efforts, it'd still been a rough night, with us hitting hurricane force 12 winds head-on as we rounded Cape Finisterre to exit Biscay and head into the wider Atlantic Ocean. Whilst A Coruña might be the more important port, Vigo is the largest city, with its population of nearly 300,000, making it the most populous city in Galicia. Much like Gijón, there is evidence of Neolithic settlement in the area, with dolmens dating back at least 5,000 years. The natural geography of the area, with lots of high ground that was easy defendable, led to the development of Castros from the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, with 28 settlements being identified in the Vigo region. The Romans arrived early, sometime around the 2nd century BCE, turning the area into an important port. During the Middle Ages, pirate attacks on the city drove the population inland, and privateers in the form of Francis Drake made 2 attempts on the city. A failed raid in 1585 followed 4 years later by him burning much of the city to the ground. In the early 19th century, the population rose up against the occupying French forces of Napoleon, driving them from the city. Vigo's position on the Atlantic coast made it an important port for trade with America, and this helped the city grow rapidly during the latter part of the 19th century. But in the 20th century, that turned into an outflow of people as thousands of Galicians emigrated to America through the port. Today, the port is still a major part of the town, being the main shipping point for Stellantis, the car giant formed by the merger of PSA Peugeot Citroën with Fiat Chrysler in 2021. High on the hill above the city sits a 17th century interpretation of those Castros in the Bronze and Iron Age, the fortress of El Castro, originally built by the Spanish in 1665 during the Portuguese Restoration War to defend the region from attacks by the English, though the war saw the oldest alliance in the world, Portugal and England, being joined by the French and Dutch to fight the Spanish. Less than 50 years later, and with France now on Spain's side, the fortress saw action during the Battle of Vigo Bay on the 23rd and 24th of October 1702, when a combined Dutch-English fleet attacked and defeated the French and Spanish navies. "17 years later, the English were back and captured the fortress along with the city during the War of the Quadruple Alliance. France, back now of Great Britain, Austria and Savoy, with the Dutch pitching in as well for old time's sake to take on the Spanish. During the Peninsular War in 1809, the fortress was occupied by the French army until, on the 28th of March, the local population rose up against the French and drove them from the town, with Spanish forces taking control of El Castro. Today, its location high on a hill overlooking the port makes it a popular park for both locals and tourists, and cruise tour groups, with 3 different Arcadia shore excursion groups all descending on the site a short while after breakfast. The next stop on our tour was the Pazo de Castrelos, a 17th century manor house and stately home located in the park of the same name to the south of the city centre. Originally the Pazo de la Vendera, it was built around 1670 and passed through various families before being inherited by María de los Milagros el Doyen, the 7th Marchioness of Valadares, and her husband Fernando Ginones de León, the Marquis of Alcedo, who undertook a major renovation of the building in the latter part of the 19th century. Following the Marchioness's death, the estate passed into the hands of her son, Fernando Ginones de León el Doyen, the 8th Marquis. However, in 1918 he died childless, and so the estate passed to his father and his wife, with the latter allowed to live in the manor house for the remainder of her life. Six years later, the father donated the property to the people of Vigo, stipulating that a museum and park be set up in the house and grounds. After negotiations with the council, an agreement on compensation was worked out with the 8th Marquis's widow to renounce her right of abode in 1935, and 2 years later, the Ginones de León Museum and Park opened to the public. Today, the museum is the city's archaeological museum, tracing the history of Vigo and the region from the prehistoric to medieval periods. The 20 hectares of parkland are now a popular public park, but within the walls of the manor house there are also the formal gardens of the estate, which can be visited and wandered around, including a 3-tiered garden made up of a rose garden, French garden and English garden, the latter complete with a folly. After the visit to the garden, the tour concluded with a scenic drive around the city and a stop at a historic hotel for tapas. I'm sensing a theme developing with P&O shore excursions before heading back to the ship. As the shore excursion was only for the morning, we were back on board of the boat in time for lunch, albeit not needing much given the tapas less than an hour earlier. As our departure time wasn't until 4 p.m, it did mean I had a couple of hours to head back out into the city for some self-exploration, starting with getting a good look at our ship moored up at the Estación Marítima de Vigo. At the top of the centre of the old town, and only later in the day did I discover linked there by a series of escalators which would have taken quite a bit of the effort out of getting up here, is the Castelo di San Sebastián. This castle was built 9 years before El Castro, at the same time as the city started to have its walls constructed under the orders of Philip IV of Spain. The site was originally a hermitage dedicated to Saint Sebastian, and the new fortifications enclosed the old chapel. The castle was built in haste and with limited resources, initially to fend off the active threat of the Portuguese and English, and consequently the structure wasn't as robust as might have been hoped for, demonstrated in 1719 when the English invaded Vigo and reduced the castle to ruins, leaving just El Castro as the main defence of the town. In the period after the destruction by the English, the site became a space for livestock. The buildings were eventually repaired, spending time as a hospital before being converted back to military barracks, a role they served until 1964, when the castle was passed into the ownership of the city council. In 1970, the then mayor of Vigo decided to relocate the town hall up from the Plaza de la Constitución to the site of the castle, and to make way for this, large parts of the castle were demolished, leaving just a small part of the outer wall that remains today, having survived another attempt in 1983 to demolish what remained. Today, the ruins of the castle offer excellent views over the harbour and the old town. Just don't look behind you at the 1970s office block town hall, which hasn't aged well. Back on the ship, with plenty of time to spare, we were able to watch the not-so-high-tech work of dispatching a 21-year-old cruise ship out of port, with most of the work being undertaken by just one dock worker manning cranes, trucks and forklift. Though the fact we weren't supposed to be here might have meant only one person wanted the overtime to work for departure. And with a gentle push of the bow thrusters, we slowly eased away from the harbour and our place of shelter in Vigo, ready to start the journey back towards the Bay of Biscay and whatever that may throw at us. After a 180-degree turn in the estuary, the Ria de Vigo, we slowly started to sail down the channel towards its mouth into the Atlantic Ocean. The estuary and the city is protected in the worst of the Atlantic weather by the Ilias Seas, an archipelago of 3 islands that sit at the mouth of the estuary and form a natural barrier. Our route out of Vigo tonight took us on the Northern Passage, taking in a view of all 3 islands as we headed out to sea. The islands are the Isla do Sur, Medio and Norte, but are more commonly known as the Isla de San Martino, Isla do Faro and Isla de Monteado respectively, roughly translating as St Martin's, Lighthouse and Sharp Mount Islands. Whilst the southern of the island, St Martin, sits by itself, the other 2 islands are actually connected by a 1,200 metre long accumulation of sand known as Rodas Beach. At high tides, the sea floats between the islands from the western side, and blocked by the beach fills a lagoon between the beach and rocks of the island. The highest point on the island is, naturally, on Sharp Mount Island, with a peak of Alto das Cíes reaching 197 metres above sea level. Our southbound transit to the Bay of Biscay had been a pretty rough crossing, with high waves and strong winds, accompanied at times by pounding rain, heralding the arrival a couple of days later of Storm Benjamin. And whilst the ship was still experiencing some movement, it wasn't enough to make walking around the ship as complicated as it had previously been, which was fortunate, as day 6 was another full day at sea with no sight of land. In a complete contrast from the southern voyage, there were large patches of blue sky and even sunny spells as we made the northern transit back from Vigo on the Spanish Atlantic coast, where we had sought shelter from the worst that Benjamin brought to the bay. In fact, the weather was so calm and unseasonably pleasant that people were even taking to the outdoor pools and hot tubs, though the internal pool remained drained for safety. A slow day on board concluded with a formal night ahead of our final port call of the journey on day 7 in Normandy. In contrast to the Spanish ports further south and much further west, dawn was well and truly underway as we completed the process of parking up in Cherbourg. The 4th largest city in Normandy and the most important port on this part of the French coast, Cherbourg has been an important town to hold since before the arrival of the Romans, who turned the Gallic fishing port into a stronghold on the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula. Cherbourg was a strategic prize during the 100 Years' War and a vital port for American troops to capture during the Normandy landings in 1944. The natural harbour was enhanced by the decision to create an artificial harbour by building a subsequently heavily fortified breakwater and then the establishment of a military port. The port grew beyond its purely military purposes in the first half of the 20th century as it became an important port of call for transatlantic liners, with a grand Gare Maritime constructed in Art Deco style to bring the rail and maritime facilities together into a single building, allowing for seamless connection under cover from train to liner. Even before the construction of the Gare Maritime, the port played a role in one of the Atlantic's worst tragedies. Cherbourg was the last port for the RMS Titanic moored in on her ill-fated maiden voyage. Had someone checked here that the box containing the binoculars could be opened, then there is a chance that the ship's sinking could have been avoided. On departing Cherbourg, the ship sailed to Cove in Ireland to board its final passengers, but boarding was by tender, with the ship remaining out of the bay and not actually docking in the Irish town. Cherbourg Gare Maritime Transatlantique was inaugurated on the 30th of July 1933 by Albert Lebrun, the President of the French Republic. Whilst partially destroyed in 1944 and the battles that raged during and after the Normandy landings, the building was restored and was in heavy use during the 1950s and 60s, a period when transatlantic liners were still the most practical way for most people from Europe to be able to, reasonably affordably, reach North America. However, the jet age and the rise of the jumbo jet led to the slow decline of the traffic, and in the early 1990s the terminal was closed, with a railway line cut back to the station in the centre of town. The building had been listed as a site of cultural heritage and the last surviving example of 1930s maritime architecture in Cherbourg in December 1989, predating its closure, ensuring that even with the railways gone, the building was protected. In 1996, an architectural competition was announced to transform the building into a naval museum, with works beginning in 1999 and the Cité de la Mer Museum opening in 2002. Coming full circle in 2006, a new cruise terminal to support Cherbourg's growing cruise industry was inaugurated, utilising the former baggage hall of the Gare Maritime Transatlantique. Cherbourg spent much of the Hundred Years' War being fought over, being a vital bridgehead for invasion by the English and French forces. Along with Calais, the control of the two harbours was vital to the control of the whole country. Cherbourg Castle was once described as one of the strongest in the world, and during the course of the Hundred Years' War changed hands 6 times as a result of deals or agreements, but never by force of arms. The siege of Cherbourg in 1450 saw a victorious French army finally expel the English from Normandy nearly 400 years after the Norman and English crowns were united by William in a field in Sussex. Sometimes rivals, sometimes allies, the relationship between England and France ensured the port was always important and continued to grow through the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. With the signing of the Entente Cordiale in 1904 and the subsequent enduring alliance between the two countries, the port has played a vital role in European wars of the 20th century, with Cherbourg being a major port for British and American troops during World War I, and the primary objective of the American troops landed at Utah Beach during the Battle of Normandy. American troops encircled the city on the 21st of June 1944, and 5 days later, after bitter resistance and street fighting, 37,000 German soldiers surrendered. Within a month of frenetic work by French and American engineers, the port, which the Germans had obliterated in bombing raids, welcomed the first Liberty ships, and from then until the victory in 1945, became the busiest port on the planet. The Americans returned control of Cherbourg to France on the 14th of October 1945. After the war, the city became an important industrial base, being the hub for the construction of France's ballistic nuclear submarine fleet from 1964 onwards. As with much of Western Europe, the city suffered from deindustrialisation from the mid-1980s onwards, with the city pivoting towards tourism and maritime-related revenue sources at the start of the 21st century, with the main focus being the Cité de la Mer Museum and the cruise terminal, both in the former Gare Maritime. The museum is today comprised of 3 main attractions. There's an exhibition of the Titanic, which visited the port nearly 30 years before the Gare Maritime was constructed, but is still a vital part of the city's maritime history. However, on days when a cruise ship is docked, a large part of the exhibition located in the Art Nouveau baggage hall is off limits as it doubles as the cruise terminal. The second attraction is the aquarium, the Oceans of the Future. The third, and perhaps most significant part of the site, is the Le Redoutable, the first French nuclear ballistic missile submarine, constructed in the city between 1964 and 1967, commissioned in 1971, and finally taken out of service 20 years later on the 1st of December 1991. 11 years later, she was opened to the public to look around as part of the founding elements of La Cité de la Mer. And today, 23 years later, she's now clocked up more years as a tourist attraction than she did as part of the French Navy. When built, Le Redoutable was 8,000 tonnes submerged, 120 metres long and 10.6 metres at its widest point, arranged over 3 decks and powered by a small nuclear generator, meaning she had an essentially unlimited range. When fully manned, she'd have 15 officers and 120 sailors on board, which is quite a lot of people to be crammed into a relatively small space, and you do get that feeling as you move around the ship on a self-guided tour that takes you in almost the whole of the submarine, from the engine room and command centre to the canteen, bunks and up to the front of the ship and the torpedo room. Though it should be noted that as part of the works to prepare the ship to become a museum between 2000 and 2002, the nuclear reactor was removed, replacing that section with an empty steel tube, so you don't have to worry about getting an unhealthy dose of radiation. The Oceans of the Future aquarium is based around the main aquarium tank, a cylindrical aquarium that's 8 metres wide and 10 metres high, with viewing platforms at various levels to take in the wide range of species that call the tank home. Alongside this, the exhibition focuses on the importance of the oceans to regulating the planet and how they can be protected both today and in the future. Though at each turn you do still keep coming back to that main tank. Several smaller tanks house other exhibits, including, if you can spot them, a pretty striking octopus. At the end of the grounds is a former World War II bunker which you can climb to the top of to take in views over La Redoutable, as well as of the harbour, and if one happens to be in, a cruise ship moored up at the Cherbourg cruise terminal. Visiting La Cité de la Mer is a safe bet when on a cruise, as the museum closes 30 minutes before all aboard time, meaning there's no excuse for missing the ship or even having to make the run of shame along the harbour side. Though this being the last port of call, and Cherbourg having regular normal ferries back to Portsmouth and Poole on the Hampshire and Dorset coasts of England respectively, it's not catastrophic if this is the port that you miss the ship from. As the harbour team prepared the ship for departure in the light of the setting sun, it was time for our final night on board before our arrival back into Southampton the following morning. Normally, the final night is always a little longer as the ship's clock revert back from European to UK time, but tonight was special. The last Saturday in October meant a leap back from 10 p.m. to 9 p.m. to correct for Europe-UK time, and then a second leap back from 2 a.m. to 1 a.m. as daylight savings time came to an end across the continent and the slow march to winter continued. Not that Benjamin appeared to have noticed that it was technically still summer when he forced us out of the bay. We cruised with P&O in late October 2025, departing Southampton on a 7-night journey to Spain and France. Southampton Cruise Terminal is located at about a mile from Southampton Central Station and around 5 miles from Southampton Airport, though no public transport links exist into the terminal, so it's either a walk or a taxi. Southampton Airport has connections to principal cities across England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, as well as Ireland, Spain, France and the Channel Islands. Southampton Central is less than 90 minutes by regular fast train from London Waterloo. Most services stop at Woking for Rail Air bus links to Heathrow Airport and its global connections.